Great to see everybody, and we're going to be looking at the end of this story. It's an amazing story, actually. I've learned so much from it, even just preparing and listening to what other people had shared. And it is really a very, very powerful story. And, last week we were looking at, the different moments of revelation and reconciliation. It was a really lovely story where he reveals himself to his brothers. And actually, in some ways, as I was preparing this week, I thought, this is actually the best bit, because this actually explains the whole purpose of his life. And, I was thinking, we started off the whole series of Joseph by looking at his father and his family. So I thought it was only fitting that we end this little study on Joseph by starting off with looking at Jacob. Whatever happened to that Jacob, and then looking at him and then going into Joseph. And, wouldn't it have been wonderful if Jacob had a file in his head, and the file in his head, when he didn't understand things, would have said, I don't understand things, so I'll just wait on the Lord. And throughout Jacob's life, he was the one that was called the grabber when he was born. And he was always, he was a twin, but he was always like trying to beat his brother, like, I need to be first. He stole the birthright, then he stole the blessing, and then he had to run away. He was always trying to sort things, always running, always chasing. Then when he got to Laban, there was all the manipulation and all the different things that were happening. And all of these different things were happening to him. And if only when different things happened, he had a file in his brain that said, I don't understand this, but I'll just wait for the Lord. Because his son was very different from him. All the things that happened to Joseph, he didn't try to figure it out. He was like, okay, I'll just wait to see what God has for me. So the difference between the son and the father was very, very different. When we get those questions, why did bad things happen to me? Why has he led me into desert? Why this? Why that? Jacob was like, okay, I'll try to figure this out. I have to go, Mom's told me to go over there to marry someone. So on the way, I'll do this and I'll try to work this out. Always trying to figure things out. Always trying to second guess God. Trying to figure it all out. Whereas his son wasn't like that. We all need to have in our heads, they speak about having files on computers, or you've got a place in your phone where you store information. We should all have a place in our hearts that says waiting for further information, and not try to figure it out ourselves. When things go wrong, okay, I'm just going to wait to see what the Lord has and what I'm going to wait for. And so, I was thinking about Joseph and thinking about the things that happened in Joseph's life. Can you imagine the difference between Joseph and Jacob? Jacob tried to fix the problems and questioned God, whereas Joseph trusted God and accepted his situation. One was self-reliant and tried to figure it out. One was God-reliant. Think about this for Joseph. These things that happened to Joseph that he filed in his file that said waiting for further information. Why did my mom have to die? I don't know, but I'll put that in that file. Why do my brothers hate me? Why did my dad love me more than everyone else by giving me a coat? Why did I get the prophetic dream that's annihilated me from the family? Why was I sold into slavery? Why did Potiphar's wife accuse me falsely? Why did my master not believe me? Why have I gone to prison? Why didn't the butler remember me to Joseph? All these why questions he had, he just put them in his file, waiting for further information, and he just rested in that. I don't know if I could have been like that. I think I would have tried to sort things out myself. Joseph is very unlike his father. He looked through a different lens. He looked through the lens of the providence of God, the sovereignty of God. God has got this, and I will rest in it. Whereas Jacob was like, I'm not sure if God's got this, so I'm going to help God out. So there were two different ways of looking at things, And we know that Joseph, this is horrible when their names are both J, I'm going to get them muddled up. But we know that Joseph look through the lens of the providence of God and look through the lens of the sovereignty of God, because at the end of 22 years, when we left the story last week, He was not a bitter man. He was serving diligently wherever God had placed him. He is patient when he's in prison. He doesn't try to fix the problems. He is kind and he forgives again and again. He is consistent and truthful. So that's why we know that he is resting in God and waiting for him, unlike his father. You know, as the story moves on, there's 3 different things that I thought we would look at today. As we end this story, you know, Jacob didn't have the same filing system as Joseph did. His attitude was, I'm going to help God. I might manipulate things. I might duck and dive. He was very fearful and very anxious, and he didn't trust God fully. And, you know, our lives can be like that. If we find ourselves, you know, tormented with fears and anxieties, it's because we're not fully relying on God. We're not fully yielding and submitting ourselves. Because I know when I churn things over in my mind and I spend hours in the middle of the night thinking of things and working things out, I'm not fully giving that over to God. I'm actually trying to sort it out myself. So I'm talking to myself here, okay, as much as everyone else. Right, the first thing to note, worship God when life is unclear and life is difficult. Worship God when life is unclear and life is difficult. It's very easy to worship God in the mountaintop, but to make that choice to worship God when life is difficult is a wonderful choice to make. It says in Genesis 46, so this is about Jacob. So Jacob set out on the journey. He's now 130 years old. He's found out that his son is alive. And Jacob has set out with everything he's owned. And before he crosses over to Egypt, he's arrived at Beersheba. Now at Beersheba, many things have happened there before. In the past, Abraham had built an altar there. Jacob had visited there before. Isaac had visited there. So Beersheba is a really important place in his journey. So he stops at Beersheba and he worships. And God speaks to him. Jacob, Jacob. And it says in the Bible, I am listening. And I would say at 130 years old, he's finally saying, I'm listening. There's nothing else I can do. I can't figure this out anymore. I'm 130. I don't have all the answers, but I am listening. And in that's something we need to learn. So I am listening. God says, I am the God of your father. And he's thinking, great. Don't be afraid of going down to Egypt. I'm going to make you into a great nation. I will go down with you. I will also bring you back here. When you die, your son Joseph will close your eyes, meaning that Joseph will be with you when you die. I mean, that's just amazing. So he's thinking, okay, let's see what happens. And God has spoken these things over his world. After the initial shock of like Joseph is alive, he then is like, oh, you can imagine him thinking, you know, he has really believed for 22 years that his son was dead and his son wasn't alive. And, you know, his son has gone. And so suddenly to be like, well, your son's alive, but also he wants to see you and you're going to get to see him. So those whole things is shock. He's a very, very old man now. God addresses some of his lifetime fears. He's saying to him, Jacob, you are 130. Change is really hard as we get older. We understand that. Change is hard, but don't worry about it. I will be with you. He's saying it's going to be there's going to be change, but don't worry about it. The second thing he says, now, Jacob, you are going down to a country where they worship pagans. It's full of idolatry, and it's far worse than Canaan, but don't worry about it. He's saying, now, I know these are other fears you have. You're taking your whole family and you've been you've been speaking to them and you've brought them all on the journey of worshiping God for the last so many years. And now you're taking them into an idolatrous country. Don't worry. I've got you. The third thing he says is, you know, Jacob's thinking, well, the last time my family went down when there was a famine, Abraham went down. My granddad went down. And, Abraham went down there, and you know, when Abraham was there, he got involved and he told lies and he was in an awful struggle, and he brought Hagar. Hagar was part of the people that came back with, because it said that he got servants and Hagar was one of them. And you know the whole legacy that was. So he's thinking, what are we doing going to Egypt? He's never gone to Egypt. He's resisted the temptation to go there. But now God is saying to him, go and he's obeying. If he had given into his fears, he would have never left Canaan and said, no, let Joseph come here. But he's yielding to God and saying, okay, I'm going to go. And the last thing is, you know, Jacob knows the prophecy that was given to Abraham. In Genesis 15:13, it said, God spoke to Abraham and said, Abraham, let me tell you what's going to happen in the future. Your descendants were going to live as outsiders. They're going to live in a foreign land. They're going to be enslaved and beaten down for 400 years. Then I will punish their slave masters, and your offspring will march back to this land of Canaan loaded with the plunder of Egypt. So he knows this prophecy. This prophecy hasn't happened yet, and he's thinking, God wants me to go to Egypt. And he's thinking, oh, I remember that prophecy. We're going to be slaves. I'm walking my whole family into slavery. He didn't know that this was going to happen immediately or not. He's thinking, I'm leaving. I'm going to a pagan country. I'm taking them out of the influence of everything they've known. I'm actually taking them to a place where you have prophesied that they're going to be slaves and they're going to be beaten down. And he said, I'm listening, Lord. I'm willing to go. And that's what happens when you yield. All of these things, you just think, okay, I don't understand it. I finally got a file in my head, says Jacob, and it says, I don't understand, but God understands it. So that's what happens. And when God sends him out, God gives him 4 promises to this old man. He says, do not be afraid of going down to Egypt. It says, 1, I will make you into a great nation. So he knows he's going to go there and they're not going to just die off. They're going to be made into a great nation. I will go down with you. You'll never be left alone. I will also bring you back again. You'll be there for a season, and Joseph will be with you. So those are 4 reassurances, because he must have had all the questions about, okay, I'm going to trust God. I'm just going to go with the flow. I'm going to go with God, and I'm going to yield. And so that's what he does. Because all of Jacob's life is like, you know, when you read Jacob's story, and I know we're looking at Joseph, but when you read Jacob's story, when he wrestles, when he does this, it's like, if you do this, then I will do this. His whole life is, Lord, if you take me, if you look after me, then this will happen. When he meets Esau, it's like, if he sees this, then he'll accept me. If he gets these gifts, then. So his whole life has been if and maybe then. And now his life is, okay, I'm yielded. I'm fully yielded to you. And that's what we have to go on. In contrast to Joseph, let's look at Joseph for just a moment. In contrast to his father, Joseph worshiped God in a strange land. Remember I said he was a teenager. He goes to this strange land. Imagine getting one of our teenagers and taking them away from their family, taking them away from their church, and putting them to live in Russia or live somewhere like live in Saudi Arabia or somewhere where there's no Christian influence, putting them somewhere and thinking, will they follow Jesus? So that's what happened with Joseph. But unlike his dad, he has learned to worship in a foreign land. And so there's 3 things about Joseph. You know, he has grown in his walk in a foreign land. He's away from his family. He can't go to church every week. He can't go to the youth on a Friday night. He has had to learn to worship God in a strange land. He's had to learn to worship through false accusations. He's had to learn to worship in prison. Joseph had been given dreams, but had no interpretation when he was just a young boy. But now in this strange land, God has perfected and improved this gift he has of dream telling, that he doesn't just give a dream, but God has given him revelation of the dream. So God has worked on his gift. And the other thing is, this guy has survived on his own, and he has become out stronger and more and closer to the Lord and closer in his walk, even though he's been separated. So the first thing was, as well as learning to worship and grow deep in a foreign land, in a desert, in a godless land, in prison, the second thing is trusting God with his perfect will and sovereign plan. What were his thoughts? I started jotting down some of the thoughts if I was Joseph, going down to a strange land. You know, what was he thinking sitting on that camel train going to Egypt? He must have felt abandonment, rejection, disbelief. I can't believe this is happening to me. I can't believe this has happened. He must have thought his dad was going to come and rescue him because he was unaware of what they told their dad. You see, he didn't know for 22 years that they have said he's dead. This is his coat. He didn't know what happened. So he's probably thinking, any day now, Dad's going to come down and rescue me. Dad's going to come down and find me. But he doesn't know that Dad thinks he's dead. So Dad's never going to look for him because he thinks he's dead. So that whole time he's there, he must have thought Dad's going to rescue him, but he was unaware of the cover-up. When he was sold, he must have thought, my dad's going to show up any one day and claim me back and say, no, he's not a slave. I'll buy him back. I'm wealthy. I can pay for him. I'll buy him back. I'll give you twice as much money. But Dad never showed up to buy him back. When he was falsely accused, he must have thought, surely God is going to strike her down. Surely God's going to come through for me. I know I'm truth. I know I'm telling the truth. Surely God, why has he let me down? All these questions he must have had. When he was serving faithfully in prison, he must have thought, surely I'm going to be let out for good behavior. I'm working so hard. Surely I'm going to be let out and someone's going to notice me. When the butler and the baker were released and they said, now remember to tell Pharaoh, he must have spent the next few days listening for someone coming down to open the door and say, hey, you're free. Guess what? It's true. Pharaoh's released you. He must have spent a long time thinking. Every day must have been like, it's going to come. They're going to remember me. Pharaoh's going to come and find me. They're going to know I'm a hard worker and all this kind of stuff. But it was another 2 years because it wasn't God's timing. And when he speaks to the butler and the baker, and this is what he says, and it's really painful actually. He gives them the interpretation. He goes, mention me to Pharaoh. Tell Pharaoh to get me out of this place. You see, he's telling them, because I was actually kidnapped from the tribe of the Hebrews. And since I've been here, I've done nothing to deserve being put in this hole. Another version says, for in fact, I was stolen. I was taken from my family. And I've done nothing wrong to let me be in this dungeon. He knew it was unfair. He's letting them know. He's not talking about, but he just said to them, hey, listen, this is where I'm from. And this is what happened to me. And still nothing happened because it's God's timing. Then when he does get out, the whole story which we spoke about, he does get out and he's set up. It is just the most amazing story because it says he goes on this road trip, to inspect the land because now he's the second most important person. He's walking with Jesus. He's close to the Lord. He's like, Lord, you have not just taken me out of prison. You have given me the most incredible job. If he had come out 2 years earlier, what would he have done as a slave? He would have had no money, no job. God kept him for 2 more years so that he had the perfect job for him. And that's why we need to wait on God. We sometimes don't understand his plans and his ways, but waiting perfects his plan in our lives. And I wonder, I said this before, I wonder as he went around the country and he came to Goshen, I wonder if he had a sense of, wow, look at this fertile land. Look at this amazing land. My family are farmers. He was an agricultural boy. He must have thought, this is the best place ever. He must have seen that. I wonder if God said to him, watch this space. Something's going to happen here. We don't know. But when he was released, for those first 7 years, the years of plenty, great things were happening. Everything was going good. He had the money. He had the resources to go back home. And he didn't, because he had learned through all these years that God's ways are not my ways and God's timing, and I will wait on him. He didn't go back. He didn't say, hey, Pharaoh, can I go and get my dad and bring him here? Or anything like that. He didn't visit. He waits on the Lord. And that's why the revelation, when he met his brothers last week and he reveals himself, I believe he was walking in step with the Holy Spirit the whole time. He didn't just go, boys, it's me, blah, blah, blah. He was wise. He thought, that's my brothers. I'm not going to reveal myself, because the Lord said, be silent, keep quiet, don't say anything. And he used an interpreter the whole time, so they had no idea. He looked different, but they had no idea. So he heard about his life because he could understand what they were saying. So when he was questioning them, they would then speak to themselves in their language, not knowing he was understanding it. Oh, we're being punished. Things are going wrong because we're being punished. And that painful bit when they said, remember the way the way our brother cried. Remember how he broke his heart and we ignored him. Can you imagine him listening and thinking, they ignored me? He would have heard the whole cover-up. He would have known that. And he knew to just wait. When he saw all 10 of them bow down, he thought, this is it. No, it's not your dream, the Holy Spirit says. Remember, in the dream, there was 11 people bowing down. So this isn't it yet. This is only 10 here. You need to get Joseph. So he is trusting the Lord and waiting for him. Even when he keeps Simeon, it says, go back and get Benjamin and get my dad and bring him back. You know, these brothers have already abandoned him. They could have easily thought, well, let's ditch Simeon. We've got loads of money, because he didn't just give them food and supplies. He actually gave them money. So now they're wealthy and they've gone back with this and they've left Simeon. I believe that was a fleece that Joseph put out there. You know, I'm going to put a fleece out. I'm going to send them back. And the Lord said, send them back. Just wait. Joseph knew it was going to be another 7 years. They didn't know that. But of course, when they needed it, they had to come back. And we know this whole story yesterday. So I believe that we spoke about last week. I believe that the whole time he wasn't trying to play tricks on them. He wasn't trying to manipulate them. He wasn't trying to use a power game on them. I believe he was just with all these different stages. When they went, they came back, and then they hid. You know, he hid the cup and all that. I believe it was revealing their heart, revealing had they changed. Was this the right time? And when it was the right time, when he couldn't hold it any longer, you know, he asked them to leave. And it was amazing. And then his brothers come and we have the whole revelation. And it was powerful. And in this little bit, Joseph said to his brothers, he said, now listen, I am going to bring you in front of the almighty Pharaoh. I'm going to bring you in front of him, and I'm going to say who you are. And when he asks you who you are and what your occupation is, you must be truthful. He's telling them, you need to trust me. You need to trust me in this. Stop playing all your games again. You need to trust me. Tell them that you're shepherds, because shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. You can imagine the brothers thinking, oh, I don't want to say I'm a shepherd. They might kill us. But they had to trust him because they had nothing else, you know. And it says in verse 33, when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You must say, your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood onwards. Then you will be allowed to stay in the region of Goshen. Guys, I've seen the perfect place. It's far away from everywhere else. It's fertile land. Your flocks will be well looked after. You will be separated from all the pagan and idol place. You'll be living in a separate place. And I believe that's where God has for you, because I just know that that's where the Holy Spirit's leading us. And so that's what they did. So when he took 5 of his brothers and they bowed down, and Pharaoh says that to him. And I just love this. God didn't just give this family the best land in Egypt, because Pharaoh speaks to them and says, and if any of you have any special ability, could you look after my livestock? So they haven't just gone to live in the best part of the land. They've now got an occupation as well of looking after the livestock. God provided separation from them, from the paganism of Egypt, so that they could grow as a nation. And 400 years later, when Moses was there, they had grown into a very powerful nation. And they did well there. The third thing, as well as worshiping in every season, as well as trusting God with our plans, the third thing is live for God and give him glory for everything that happens to you. And this is the crux of his story. So Joseph, I love this bit, he settled his father and his brothers in Egypt. He gave them property in the best part of the land, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and his father's household with food according to the number of children they had, because there's famine for another 5 years. He provided for them financially. The Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property, they were fruitful, and they greatly increased in numbers. Remember what God said in Beersheba? And Jacob's thinking, wow, God is right. I've yielded to him. I brought my family here, and look how God has blessed us above and beyond anything we deserve. And that would be a great story. I would love to say, and they lived happily ever after. That's how it should end. But it doesn't end like that. I think it's interesting, when Joseph is 17 years old, he's taken away, he's sold into slavery, and then he's away for 22 years. Then when he's reunited with his dad, his dad is 130. It says his dad lived for 147 years. That's exactly 17 years. It's like God gave him another 17 years. Those 17 years you had him? You've got another 17 years with your beloved son. Isn't that lovely? I think that's lovely. So 17 years later, here's the next bit of the story. 17 years later, Jacob's about to die. And they're all, he's dying, he speaks, and we can't go over it, but he speaks and prophesies into each of those 12 sons, and those, they become the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob gets a double blessing because he then uses both of his sons, and they have a tribe each. Anyways, Joseph prophesies over them. Jacob prophesies over them. Jacob dies. And he's embalmed for 2.5 months. All of Egypt is mourning Jacob. And then Joseph says, my father was buried here. Can I go back? This is the first time Joseph has ever returned to his homeland that's recorded. And he goes back to Canaan to bury his dad. And, they did all the rites and everything. And they go back. The final words of Beersheba are come forth, that Joseph was able to be with him. And when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, guess what happens? They become panicked. They revert back to their old self. Oh no, what's going to happen now? What if, what happens? They've lived with Joseph for 17 years and they can't see through his character. They are so insecure inside, they're so anxious inside that they're worried. And so they send a report. Joseph, by the way, just to let you know, just before Dad died, he did say, and they make up this story. Just before Dad died, he said, now remember, please be kind to your brothers. No, I don't think Jacob said any of that stuff. But they went to him saying, oh, this, that, and the other. And, this is the final time. Joseph weeps many times throughout his story. This is the final time that Joseph wept. Joseph came to them. The brothers threw themselves down again and said, we are your slaves forever. Please treat us well. It said Joseph wept. He said, am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives, the saving of a nation that in 400 years would march out and go back to Israel. So then, please don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children and your children's children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. It's so interesting. The brothers resorted to their old ways. It's almost like they're mini Jacobs, still trying to work it out, still trying to figure it out, They resorted to their old ways. They were worried. The peacemaker dad had gone. They were living in fear that Joseph was now going to enslave them all and turn around. But Joseph is not like that. He doesn't keep any bitterness. They can't forgive themselves. And this is a real... I think many people in here would identify with this. How many times can we not forgive ourselves? Sometimes it's easier to forgive other people, but sometimes we find it difficult to forgive ourselves and to let ourselves off the hook. Sometimes we're really hard on ourselves, and we almost punish ourselves. We persecute ourselves. God is saying, look, I've forgiven you. The sins you're talking about, the things that are problems in your world, I've actually thrown them into the deepest sea, and I don't even think about them anymore. You need to let go of it. And I would say to all of us in here, let go of things that you don't need to be holding on to. We live with guilt, and they lived with guilt. And, they were living with what happens when Dad dies, what's going to happen, this is the plan. When Dad dies, we'll all get down, we'll all say to Joseph, we'll make up this story, yeah, we're all in together, good, pinky promise, we've all said the right thing. But the Lord is not like that. He doesn't do that. God isn't like that. And Joseph wept, and when he wept, this is what he was saying. This is what he was saying to them. He was saying, I've written it somewhere. He was saying, don't be afraid. He was speaking to their fear and anxiety. Don't be afraid. He was saying, am I in the place of God? He was saying, listen, God is sovereign. You intended it for harm, but God sent me ahead. Imagine if I hadn't been here. What would have become of us in our homeland? We would all be dead now. The Egyptians would have never accepted you. They would have never sold stuff to you and sold grain to you. You were able to buy that stuff because I was in charge and I saw you coming. God had sent me ahead of you. You intended for harm, but it's for good. He was reminding them of Isaiah 55, even though it hadn't even been written then, about God's ways are not our ways. His plans are not our plans. He said, don't be afraid. Again, he speaks to their fears. I will provide for you and your children. He speaks to their future. And then he reassures them again, and he says, and he spoke kindly to them. You know, kindness is everything. You know, kindness will bring people into church. Kindness will keep people in church. Kindness will lead people to Jesus. Because when you're kind, and you're kind with your time, you're kind with your words, you're kind with your generosity, you've got an open-handedness to people, that is the most attractive thing to bring people on the journey. I find it interesting that Joseph died before any of his brothers. Remember, he was younger. He was the youngest. I know there wasn't much age difference, but Joseph died before them all. I find that interesting. He must have, the hard life must have had a toll on him, but he died first. And when he speaks to them, he said, I just want one thing from you. Will you carry my bones back and bury me with my father? And, he didn't ask them to bury him and take them. It's interesting, he said, take my bones back with you. They didn't then take his bones and go and do that. Maybe it was a different era. This was now 50, 60 years. It might have been a different Pharaoh. So he didn't want to risk the brothers leaving and going back there because it wasn't God's timing. So he said, when it's the right time, when God says it's right, when God takes you home, and you have another 350 years to stay here, when the time is right, take my bones. And it's a beautiful bit just before the Israelites are now 2 million people. 70 people went into Egypt. Now 2 million people come back 400 years later. And they said, and they gathered his bones and took their bones back with them. And his bones were buried in the land that he never really got to spend much time in. But God was with him because he understood worshiping God in a foreign land, trusting God when he didn't understand things, and living for God and giving God all the glory. He didn't say, when they came to him and said, oh, Dad's died, blah, blah, blah. He didn't say, you know what, I've really saved you, and it's been good, it's amazing, I was in this position. There's no I in this story. It's all God, God, God. And that's how he's lived his life. And it is a beautiful story. And because he was faithful to his post, we have, from the tribe of Levi, Moses, John the Baptist, Zachariah, and Elizabeth. From Benjamin, we have Paul in the New Testament and Jeremiah. From Ephraim, we have Samuel, Hannah, Naomi, Boaz, Joshua, Hosea. I could go on. Each of those tribes had amazing people because God had planned that Joseph would be there and lead the people out. What God spoke in Genesis 15 to Abraham about what would happen to his seed came true. And it only came true when they yielded to his perfect will and his perfect plan. And in conclusion, I could go through all the different tribes, but time doesn't allow. Let's make sure that, that song we sing, I love that song, Praise. I'm going to praise him in the mountain or the valley. Learn to praise him in wherever you find yourself. And it says, I'm going to praise him when I'm sure and when I'm doubting. You're going to trust him when you're confident or when you're not confident, when things don't make sense. You're going to trust him in those areas. Honor the commitments that you make to him. When he's asked you to do things, honor what he's asked you to do. Wherever he's asked you to serve. Joseph didn't just serve as a prime minister. He served in the prison and he looked after the other prisoners. Wherever God has placed you is your mission field, and just live the most you can for God, live the best you can for God, and give him all honor in everything that's due. I can remember, I'll just end with this one illustration. I can remember many years ago when Mum and Dad were leaving Fraserburgh and they were coming to Aberdeen, and I remember a fellow pastor had spoken to me and said, I hear your dad's moving to Aberdeen. I said, I know. And they said, and what's he doing that for? He was almost 60, and, him and your mom are moving there. And, and I think this pastor actually was quite keen he thought he would maybe be called to Aberdeen, but actually Dad felt he was called. So they'd come, and I remember I was only in my early 30s then. Daniel wasn't born then, so I just had 4 wee girls. And I remember just something rose in me, and I said, you know something? I'll tell you something. God will build a great church in Aberdeen, not because he's sending a great man to lead it, but because everything my dad has done, he's given God the glory, and God has blessed him again and again and again. And God breathed favor over my dad, not because he was a wonderful man or a great orator. He was an ordinary man like us. But everything he did, if you asked him, he goes, oh, it's amazing, God did this, God did that. He gave God glory. And I believe Joseph was just an ordinary little boy. But because he gave God honor in everything, God blessed him abundantly. And that's how we need to live our lives. Worship him with abandonment. Trust him fully when you don't understand it, and give him glory for whatever happens in your life, okay? There's a few questions we'll look at. They'll come on the board here. There's a few questions. Have a chat about them, and we'll see how we get on. Okay, thank you.